They laughed when the quiet woman from the hotel kitchen touched the piano keys, but less than 10 minutes later, some of the most powerful people in Manhattan would be standing in absolute silence. The Grand Astoria Ballroom shimmered beneath golden chandeliers worth more than most American homes, their reflections dancing across polished marble floors as servers moved carefully between tables draped in white silk. Wealthy donors, celebrities, and elite musicians filled the enormous room with polished laughter and expensive perfume, while cameras from a nationally streamed arts fundraiser captured every glamorous second. At the center of it all stood Victor Hale, America's most celebrated concert pianist. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his silver cufflinks caught the stage lights every time he lifted his champagne glass. At 46, Victor had built a reputation not only for extraordinary talent, but for humiliating anyone he considered beneath him, and tonight he was in rare form. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced smoothly into the microphone, his voice echoing through the ballroom, "our scheduled pianist unfortunately suffered a minor hand injury about 20 minutes ago." A disappointed murmur spread across the crowd. Victor smiled faintly, clearly enjoying the tension. "But don't worry," he continued. "It appears the hotel staff has graciously provided a replacement." Soft laughter rippled through the room as Victor turned dramatically toward the side entrance near the kitchen corridor. Clara Bennett froze beneath the dim hallway light, still holding the folded linen napkin in her trembling hands. At 38, Clara looked nothing like the glamorous women surrounding the stage. Her dark blonde hair was tied into a simple low bun, and her modest navy blue uniform blended almost invisibly into the background of the luxury hotel. She had spent the last 4 years avoiding attention, avoiding cameras, avoiding stages, but now hundreds of wealthy strangers were staring directly at her. "Come on," Victor said with a grin sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't be shy. Everyone deserves a chance to pretend they're an artist." More laughter erupted. Several guests lifted their phones, already recording. Clara's chest tightened as memories she had buried for nearly a decade began clawing their way back to the surface. The bright stage lights, the crushing pressure, the headlines that destroyed her life overnight. Near the front row, an elderly woman wearing diamonds around her neck suddenly leaned forward in shock, her expression draining of color the moment she saw Clara's face, clearly beneath the ballroom lights. Meanwhile, Victor gestured toward the grand piano with theatrical amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smirked, "let's see what the kitchen staff can do." And for the first time that evening, the enormous ballroom began to grow strangely quiet. Clara Bennett could feel every pair of eyes in the ballroom following her as she slowly stepped forward from the kitchen corridor, her black flats barely making a sound against the marble floor. The silence spreading through the Grand Astoria felt heavier than the laughter from moments earlier. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, while cameras continued streaming. The gala live to thousands of viewers across the country, capturing every second of what most people in the room believed would become a humiliating joke. Victor Hale leaned casually against the glossy black piano, swirling champagne in his glass with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being admired. "Do not worry," he said into the microphone with a polished grin. "We are lowering expectations tonight." More laughter echoed through the ballroom, though softer this time. Clara kept her eyes lowered as she approached the stage. Years ago, applause had once followed her everywhere. Now she could barely handle strangers looking directly at her. Near the front row, the elderly woman in diamonds continued staring at Clara with growing disbelief. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, former chairwoman of the Manhattan Philharmonic Foundation, and one of the most respected figures in classical music. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "No," she whispered under her breath, "it cannot be." Clara reached the piano bench and stopped. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of the Grand Steinway. For a brief second she saw another version of herself, younger, confident, wearing silver concert gowns beneath stage lights in Vienna, Boston, and New York, before the scandal, before the headlines, before the videos that turned America against her overnight. She quickly pushed the memories away. "Go ahead," Victor said smugly. "Play anything you know. Maybe something simple." Several guests smirked, while others raised their phones higher, waiting for the awkward disaster they expected. Clara slowly removed the thin black serving gloves from her hands. The moment her fingers touched the piano keys, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that a strange hush settled over the ballroom once again. Victor noticed it immediately, the way her posture changed, the way her shoulders straightened, the way her trembling suddenly disappeared. Clara closed her eyes softly, inhaling once through unsteady lungs. She had not touched a concert piano in almost 8 years. 8 years of hiding inside hotel kitchens, avoiding interviews, pretending music no longer existed inside her. Yet the moment her fingertips rested against the ivory keys, muscle memory awakened like something ancient and unstoppable. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Whitmore slowly rose from her chair, her face pale with realization. "Dear God," she breathed, "that is Clara Royce." And then the first note finally echoed through the room. The first note drifted through the Grand Astoria Ballroom, like smoke curling through still air, soft and controlled, yet powerful enough to stop every whispered conversation instantly. The room froze. Even the servers carrying silver trays paused mid-step as the sound of Clara's playing rolled beneath the crystal chandeliers with impossible precision. Victor Hale's confident smile weakened slightly. He had expected hesitation, panic, a clumsy mistake that would entertain his wealthy guests for a few harmless minutes, before security quietly escorted the embarrassed hotel worker away from the stage. Instead, Clara's fingers moved across the piano with calm authority, each note flowing seamlessly into the next, with the kind of emotional control that could not be learned from casual lessons or hobby classes. This was mastery, pure and terrifying mastery. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Whitmore slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her breathing uneven as memories flooded her mind. 8 years earlier, Clara Royce had been the brightest rising star in American classical music. Critics once called her performances supernatural. Tickets for her concerts sold out within hours, from Boston to Los Angeles. At only 30 years old, she had been preparing for an international tour, expected to make history. Then everything vanished overnight. Eleanor still remembered the scandal dominating every television screen in America. Accusations, viral headlines, endless public humiliation. Clara disappeared before anyone could hear her side of the story. And now she was standing here wearing a hotel uniform, while the same elite society that destroyed her laughed at her moments earlier. Victor swallowed hard as Clara transitioned into a notoriously difficult passage with flawless timing. Several professional musicians seated near the stage exchanged stunned glances. One man quietly lowered his phone, suddenly ashamed he had been recording to mock her. Another guest whispered, "That is impossible." But Clara barely noticed the audience, and the ballroom had disappeared around her. The cruel laughter, the cameras, the fear, it all faded beneath the music pouring from her fingertips, like years of buried pain finally escaping into the open air. Her posture straightened further as confidence returned piece by piece with every measure she played. Then came the shift. Clara moved into a haunting section of the composition, so emotionally raw that an uncomfortable silence swept through the room. A woman near the back covered her mouth. One donor quietly wiped tears from his eyes without understanding why. Victor stared at Clara in disbelief as realization slowly settled into his chest. He knew this piece. Very few pianists in the world could perform it correctly, and only one woman had ever made audiences cry with it the way this woman was doing now. The same woman he had just humiliated in front of the entire country. For the first time that night, Victor Hale looked genuinely afraid. The music continued rising through the ballroom with breathtaking control, each note carrying years of loneliness, humiliation, and grief that words could never fully explain. Clara's fingers glided across the ivory keys with impossible precision, while the massive live-stream audience exploded online in confusion and disbelief. Comments flooded the screen mounted beside the stage. "Who is she? That cannot be a hotel worker. Wait, Clara Royce?" The atmosphere inside the Grand Astoria had completely transformed. Just minutes earlier, guests had been laughing into champagne glasses, amused by the idea of watching a nervous kitchen employee embarrass herself in front of Manhattan's elite. Now nobody laughed. Nobody even moved. Victor Hale stood frozen near the piano, his face drained of color, as Clara entered the most technically brutal movement of the composition. It was a section notorious for destroying even experienced concert pianists under pressure. Yet Clara played it with frightening elegance, her expression calm, almost detached, as though the piano itself had become the only safe place left in the world for her. Eleanor Whitmore slowly rose to her feet again, unable to remain seated any longer. "I knew it," she whispered emotionally. Several nearby guests turned toward her. "That is Clara Royce, the greatest pianist this country ever lost." A ripple of shock spread through the ballroom. One younger musician stared at Eleanor in disbelief, but she disappeared. Eleanor's eyes never left Clara. "No," she answered quietly. "She was destroyed." Across the stage, Victor suddenly remembered something he had spent years trying to forget. 8 years ago, when the scandal erupted against Clara Royce, he had been one of the loudest voices condemning her publicly. Television interviews, articles, statements about preserving the integrity of classical music. At the time, attacking Clara had elevated his own career overnight. Audiences loved heroes and villains, and America had chosen Clara as its villain before hearing the truth. Victor had benefited from her downfall more than anyone, and now she was here, alive, playing better than ever. His stomach tightened with panic as another wave of online comments appeared on the live stream monitor. Victor Hale mocked Clara Royce? "This is insane. She is better than him." Clara remained completely unaware of the growing chaos around her. Her eyes stayed closed as the music swelled into its emotional climax, so powerful that several guests openly wiped tears from their faces. Even hardened critics sitting near the front looked shaken. Then Clara struck a final thunderous chord that echoed through the ballroom ceiling before fading slowly into absolute silence. No applause came at first. The room was too stunned to react. Hundreds of wealthy strangers simply stared at the woman they had mocked less than 10 minutes earlier. Victor Hale could hear his own heartbeat pounding inside his chest, because deep down he already understood something terrible. Clara Royce had not just returned tonight. She had returned in front of the entire world. For 3 long seconds after the final chord faded away, the Grand Astoria ballroom remained completely motionless. No glasses clinked, no whispered conversations returned. Even the live stream crew near the back of the room stood frozen behind their cameras as Clara Bennett slowly lowered her trembling hands from the piano keys. The silence felt almost sacred, as though nobody inside the ballroom trusted themselves to breathe too loudly and break whatever extraordinary thing had just happened in front of them. Then suddenly, one person began clapping. Eleanor Whitmore. The sharp sound echoed alone through the ballroom at first, before another guest joined in, then another. Within moments, the entire room erupted into thunderous applause, so overwhelming that several chandeliers vibrated softly overhead. Guests who had mocked Clara only minutes earlier were now standing on their feet, applauding with stunned expressions and watery eyes. Some people shouted her name. Others simply stared at her in disbelief, trying to understand how a woman serving drinks in a luxury hotel had just delivered one of the greatest live piano performances they had ever witnessed. Clara remained seated for a moment, breathing unevenly as the applause crashed around her like waves. She looked overwhelmed, almost frightened by the attention returning to her after so many years of hiding. Victor Hale, however, looked as though the floor beneath him had disappeared entirely. His confident stage presence had collapsed into visible panic. He glanced repeatedly toward the giant livestream monitor, where social media notifications exploded faster than the system could process them. Clara Royce is alive. Victor Hale humiliated her publicly. This is the comeback of the decade. Millions of viewers were already sharing clips online. Reporters in the ballroom quietly stepped away from their tables and began making frantic phone calls. Victor swallowed hard as he realized the narrative he had controlled for 8 years was unraveling in real time. Eleanor Whitmore approached the stage slowly, emotion filling her aging eyes. "Clara," she said softly, her voice shaking through the microphone someone accidentally left on nearby. The entire ballroom immediately quieted again. "I searched for you for years." Clara finally looked up at her. For the first time all evening, vulnerability cracked through her calm expression. I did not want to be found," she answered quietly. A painful hush swept through the crowd. Several guests lowered their eyes in shame, suddenly remembering the cruel headlines they once believed without question. Victor felt cold realization settling deeper into his chest with every passing second. Because the audience was no longer admiring him tonight, they were comparing him to her, and the comparison was destroying him. Clara slowly stood from the piano bench, her simple navy uniform still making her look more like hotel staff than a world-famous musician. Yet somehow that only made the moment more powerful. True greatness had walked quietly among them all night long, and they had laughed at it. The applause continued rolling through the Grand Astoria Ballroom, long after Clara stepped away from the piano bench, but she no longer looked at the audience. Her breathing remained uneven as years of buried memories pressed heavily against her chest. The standing ovation surrounding her should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt painfully familiar. Once upon a time, crowds like this had adored her, and then those same crowds had destroyed her with equal enthusiasm. Victor Hale attempted to recover his composure, forcing a strained smile as cameras remained pointed directly at him. "Well," he said awkwardly into the microphone, his voice noticeably weaker now. "It seems our surprise guest still remembers a few notes." A few uncomfortable chuckles scattered weakly through the room before immediately dying away. Nobody wanted to laugh with him anymore. The shift in power had become impossible to ignore. Clara slowly turned toward Victor for the first time since she began playing. Her expression remained calm, but the sadness in her eyes unsettled him more than anger ever could. "You always did know how to entertain a crowd," she said quietly. The ballroom fell silent again. Victor's throat tightened. Eleanor Whitmore looked sharply toward him, already sensing the deeper history beneath Clara's words. "Clara," Eleanor asked gently, "why did you disappear?" For several seconds Clara did not answer. She stared instead at the massive ballroom filled with wealthy strangers, television personalities, donors, and critics. Some looked ashamed, others looked fascinated. A few appeared deeply uncomfortable, as old memories resurfaced in their minds. Finally, Clara spoke softly into the silence, because nobody wanted the truth. The words landed heavily across the room. Victor immediately looked away. Clara folded her serving gloves carefully in her hands before continuing. 8 years ago, every network, every newspaper, every music foundation decided I was guilty before asking a single question. Her voice never rose, yet somehow every word cut deeper because of its restraint. People I trusted stayed silent because protecting their careers mattered more than protecting the truth. Eleanor's face slowly hardened as realization dawned. She turned toward Victor with visible disgust. Several reporters nearby exchanged tense glances while quietly recording every second. Clara looked exhausted now, as though speaking openly, after years of silence required more strength than the performance itself. After a while, she admitted softly, hiding became easier than fighting people who had already made up their minds. The room remained completely still. No one interrupted her. No one dared to. Victor could feel the audience pulling further away from him with every sentence Clara spoke. Online, the live stream had already become national news. Journalists outside the ballroom doors were gathering by the dozens. Publicists rushed nervously between tables, whispering into cell phones. But Clara seemed untouched by the chaos exploding around her. She simply stood there in her modest hotel uniform beneath million-dollar chandeliers, looking smaller than everyone around her, and somehow more powerful than all of them combined. Then her eyes met Victor's one final time. "You were not cruel because I was weak," she said quietly. "You were cruel because you thought nobody would ever challenge you." And once again, the room went completely silent. Victor Hale stood beneath the ballroom lights, gripping the microphone so tightly that the veins in his hand became visible beneath his tailored sleeve. For the first time in his celebrated career, he looked like a man losing control in front of an audience that no longer admired him. The silence after Clara's words felt unbearable. Wealthy donors shifted awkwardly in their seats, while reporters moved closer to the stage, sensing the story transforming into something far bigger than a surprise musical performance. Clara Bennett remained perfectly still beside the piano, her simple navy uniform sharply contrasting the luxury surrounding her. Yet somehow she commanded the entire room without raising her voice once. Eleanor Whitmore stepped closer to her carefully. "Clara," she asked softly, "was the scandal even true?" The question seemed to suck the remaining air from the ballroom. Victor immediately looked toward Clara with visible panic flashing across his face. He already knew the answer. He simply prayed she would not say it publicly. Clara's eyes lowered briefly toward the piano keys before she finally answered. "No." The word hit the room harder than any scream could have. Several guests gasped quietly. One reporter near the front almost dropped his phone. Clara continued speaking with calm restraint, though years of heartbreak lingered behind every syllable. The financial accusations were fabricated by people protecting sponsorship deals and careers. When I tried to defend myself, nobody wanted to listen because scandal sells faster than truth. Victor closed his eyes briefly as memories came rushing back. 8 years earlier, private conversations had circulated among elite figures in the classical music industry. Sponsors feared losing money. Executives feared public controversy. Someone needed to become the sacrifice that protected everyone else. Clara Royce had simply been the easiest target, and Victor had benefited enormously from her disappearance. Eleanor's expression slowly hardened with fury. "You knew," she said coldly toward Victor. The room turned toward him instantly. "Sssss," Victor forced out an uneasy breath. "It was complicated," he muttered weakly. "Complicated?" Eleanor repeated sharply. "You publicly destroyed a young woman's life because it helped your career." Cameras immediately swung toward Victor's pale face. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but stopped when he realized there was nothing left to say. The audience already saw him differently now, not as a legendary pianist, not as a respected artist, but as a coward who helped bury someone more talented than himself. Clara looked exhausted by the conversation. She had spent nearly a decade carrying humiliation quietly, while the world celebrated the people who abandoned her. Yet even now she showed no anger, only sadness. "I did not come here for revenge," she said softly. "I only wanted to survive." Those words shattered whatever remained of the room's emotional defenses. Several people openly cried now. Victor lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes anymore, because deep down he understood something irreversible had happened tonight. Clara Royce had reclaimed her dignity without ever begging for it, and Victor Hale had lost his in front of the entire world. The atmosphere inside the Grand Astoria Ballroom had changed so completely that it no longer felt like the same event. Only an hour earlier, wealthy donors and celebrated musicians had arrived expecting another glamorous night of performances and polished speeches. Now the ballroom felt like the center of a public reckoning. Reporters lined the edges of the room with phones raised high, while live-stream viewers climbed into the millions across social media platforms. Every camera remained fixed on Clara Bennett. Yet, despite becoming the focus of national attention once again, she looked as though she wanted nothing more than to disappear quietly back into the hotel corridors, where nobody noticed her existence. Eleanor Whitmore stepped beside Clara protectively, almost like a mother guarding someone the world had failed. "You should tell them everything," Eleanor urged softly. Clara gave a faint shake of her head. "What would be the point?" she asked quietly. "People already decided who I was years ago." Before Eleanor could answer, a younger reporter near the front suddenly spoke up. "That is not true anymore." The room turned toward him. He swallowed nervously before continuing. "People online are already uncovering evidence from the old investigation. Financial records, emails, statements that never match the accusations against you." A murmur spread rapidly through the crowd. Victor Hale visibly stiffened. One donor hurriedly checked his phone before his face drained of color. Another guest whispered, "Oh my God." The story was collapsing publicly in real time. Clara looked stunned for the first time all evening. For years she had carried the belief that the world had completely forgotten her, that the truth had been buried too deeply to ever resurface. But now journalists, musicians, and even strangers online were beginning to question the narrative that destroyed her life. Victor suddenly stepped toward the microphone again, desperation creeping into his voice. "We should all be careful before jumping to conclusions," he said quickly. "A lot happened back then that people do not fully understand. But the authority he once carried had vanished. The room no longer trusted him." Eleanor looked directly at Victor with cold disappointment. "No," she replied firmly. "What happened was that powerful people protected themselves, while an innocent woman paid the price." Several guests nodded quietly. Others avoided eye contact entirely, ashamed they had once celebrated Clara's downfall without hesitation. Clara stood motionless beside the piano as the truth slowly unfolded around her, like something too overwhelming to fully process. Her eyes drifted across the ballroom toward the live-stream cameras, broadcasting every second nationwide. Somewhere beyond those cameras, millions of people were hearing her voice, again for the first time in nearly a decade, not as a scandal, not as a fallen prodigy, but as a human being. Victor lowered his gaze as another wave of online notifications flooded the ballroom screens behind him. Sponsors were already distancing themselves publicly. News networks were demanding interviews. His carefully protected reputation was unraveling faster than he could stop it. And standing quietly, only a few feet away from him, was the woman he once believed would never return. By midnight, the Grand Astoria Ballroom no longer resembled a glamorous charity gala. It had become the place where one woman quietly reclaimed her dignity, while an entire industry was forced to confront its own cruelty. Outside the hotel, reporters crowded the sidewalks, beneath flashing camera lights, as breaking news banners spread across national television. Inside, however, the atmosphere had grown strangely subdued. Conversations were softer now. Smiles looked uncertain. People who once valued reputation above integrity suddenly understood how quickly public judgment could turn against them. Clara Bennett stood near the edge of the ballroom, beside the service entrance she had walked through earlier that night, carrying folded napkins and avoiding eye contact like she had every evening for the past 4 years. Only now, nobody looked past her anymore. Hotel employees stared at her with astonishment. Guests moved aside respectfully when she walked by. Several young musicians approached nervously, asking for photographs, but Clara declined politely each time. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired. Victor Hale remained alone near the stage, abandoned by nearly everyone who had surrounded him earlier in the evening. Sponsors had quietly left the ballroom. His publicist argued frantically into a phone near the exit, while reporters continued broadcasting updates about the resurfacing evidence connected to Clara's old scandal. Every few minutes, Victor glanced toward Clara as though searching for some way to undo what had happened tonight. But deep down, he already understood certain moments could never be reversed. Eleanor Whitmore approached Clara one final time, holding a small silver card in her hand. "The Philharmonic wants to arrange a concert," she said gently. "Every major orchestra in the country will call you tomorrow." Clara looked down at the card but did not take it immediately. "I do not know if I belong in that world anymore," she admitted quietly. Eleanor's eyes softened. "That world stopped deserving you a long time ago." For the first time all evening, a faint smile touched Clara's face. Small, fragile, but real. Across the ballroom, several guests watched the exchange silently, perhaps realizing that greatness rarely announces itself with arrogance. Sometimes it arrives quietly wearing a hotel uniform, while the world laughs at it by mistake. Clara finally accepted the card before glancing once more toward the grand piano still glowing beneath the chandelier. The same piano that had transformed humiliation into truth in less than 10 minutes. Without another word, she turned and walked calmly toward the service hallway, leading back into the quiet parts of the hotel. No dramatic speech, no revenge, no celebration, just soft footsteps fading against marble floors, while hundreds of people watched her leave in silence. And somewhere deep inside that enormous ballroom, many finally understood the lesson they should have learned years ago. Talent does not disappear because the world chooses cruelty, and dignity does not need permission to return. Thank you for watching this powerful story of dignity and respect. If you enjoyed this lesson on character, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to support our channel.